Let's Corp is the technology company behind Let's Respond, one of the most sought after smart solutions by law enforcement to prevent and de escalate crises. Visit http://www.letscorp.us/respond to learn more. Hey, and welcome back to Policing Matters on policeone.com. I'm your host, Jim Dudley. Hopefully, you're checking us out on our YouTube channel as well, where you get to see my guest, and unfortunately, you get to see me as well. Well, my guest today, you're going to want to listen, is Thor Eells, Executive Director of the National Tactical Officers Association. He is here to discuss current NTOA activities and trends in SWAT training and deployment. And Commander Eells served more than 30 years with the Colorado Springs Police Department, retiring in 2017. His assignments included operator, team commander, and division commander. As commander of the Specialized Enforcement Division, he was responsible for highly specialized units such as SWAT, K9, EOD, traffic enforcement, special events, and air support. He's also a graduate of the FBI National Academy and Center for Creative Leadership. Well, we had quite a discussion even before we started recording just on your title and your name, and it's so great to finally land you on the program. Welcome, Thor Eells.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the invitation.
Yeah, great to have you. So you have your finger on the pulse of all things SWAT. What are the national issues in tactical operations today?
Well, we try to have our finger on the pulse, but as you're fully aware with your background, it's a dynamic and kinetic environment that we're live and work in today, arguably maybe the most challenging of times. So I would say, there are several things that are capturing our attention. A lot of it has to do with civil unrest and the utilization of tactical teams, SWAT teams in public order scenarios and how those are impacting policing, how we're able to deliver services within our communities, but trying to do it in a way that we're doing it right. And as you might well be aware of, as many of our listeners may be as well, a SWAT team is not a crowd control team. And we're not necessarily equipped the same way with the same equipment necessary to be safe in the different respective environments, nor is the training. But unfortunately, SWAT teams, tactical teams are often the one unit that command staff considers a discretionary resource, meaning we can tap into them and we can throw them at any particular problem. And as we're all aware, civil unrest has been an issue these last couple of years and is quite likely going to be a challenge here in the next few months, maybe a year or more. And we're trying to pay attention to ensure that the right training is available, the right equipment is available, and guide folks in being best prepared for these incidents. Would be one area that we're very heavily involved in. Still very involved in, what are commonly referred to as SWAT standards. We refer them to as our tactical response and operations standards, and trying to provide guidance through that to teams. As we were discussing earlier, not all teams are the same, and not all equipment is the same, not the same number of personnel. Funding is available, and so there are a multitude of different ways that agencies are having to try and meet this need. And our TROS is an evolving, living document. It just underwent its most recent update and iteration, and I think it's our best one yet in terms of helping agencies navigate this landscape. And so And then alongside that, I'm very happy to announce that we completed an equivalent of that in public order. So there are public order standards in how to develop 3 levels of team: a basic, intermediate, and advanced. We created from scratch a 40-hour command school, all of which is centered around existing and developing case law. So how does that impact what we can do and how we can do it and protect people's constitutional rights and yet be successful in our mission delivery? And probably the last big thing that I would say that we're still heavily involved in is taking a look at all levels of response within policing when the mentally ill are in crisis, whether it's a patrol officer dealing with somebody on the street corner or all the way up through a barricade situation. How do we navigate that, recognizing that frequently that's not a criminal event, it's a civil situation. And so the law and how it impacts our decision making is vastly different. We're trying to ensure that we share that information and provide them with a lot of knowledge, believing that knowledge is power, and hopefully we use it the right way.
Yeah, absolutely. And you talked about 3 really important issues, and I agree with you that I think we're entering another era of protests and demonstrations, especially considering the Middle East, and then we have elections coming up. And in California, we have post standards. I was on a commission to develop post standards for our tactical teams, the amount of training and equipment that they get. And we also have a mobile field force concept where smaller agencies who don't have the ability to form up a full-time tactical team or multiple tactical teams, that they could ally with other agencies within their counties or their region to form up a platoon or more of tactical trained officers. Is that a concept that is common around the nation?
I think it's split, to be quite honest with you. There is still an awful lot of the sandbox mentality, if you will, in that, I want to play in my own sandbox with my own toys. And we struggle a little bit with sharing. I'm happy to say, though, that I think that thought process is beginning to crumble, and more agencies are beginning to appreciate the need for multi-jurisdictional cooperation, regionalization, the sharing of specific assets, personnel as force multipliers, so that they are better able to effectively respond to these situations and do it with confidence, do it with a great deal of comfort that the personnel have the right equipment, they have the right training, and they're going to perform well, and leads to more positive outcomes. We have, unfortunately, a long distinguished list of our failures in which we didn't probably do as well as we could have or should have, knowing that we had ample time to prepare, to plan, and to have these conversations. But as we are both fully aware, we live in a very fast-moving environment, and there are a lot of competing interests for leadership to be dealing with, and they're torn a multitude of directions. And oftentimes, we just don't believe that these things can happen in our communities, or the chances of it happening are so remote that they direct those limited resources and things elsewhere until it does become an issue.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think we are doing a much better job as a whole in working with one another and cooperating and signing, MOUs, memorandum of understandings, and IGA, intergovernmental agreements, things of that nature are being accomplished more regularly.
Sure. Yeah, the mutual aid is important, especially with dwindling resources and lower personnel, across the board. I think the training aspect that you talked about to standardization and common terms and things like that, that's awesome for the on the ground operators, but also commander schools. So where a commander, maybe a captain or above, also has the idea of capabilities and how things work out and what's necessary, rather than just ordering something without knowing, all the implications. We've seen, just as you said, some failures where, orders from above were to fire ERAW or something like that when it didn't follow policy or procedure. And we saw the negative consequences of that. So great that you've thought ahead to bring in the command element as well, so that they know what they're asking for and they know what's available to them.
Yeah, that was important to us. I mean, it was a overwhelming consensus that we start there, that it is very important to have really good command decision making sets the tone. Frequently, when you look at a lot of the failures in after action reports, it occurs at the command level, not because they're not smart people or that they're not well intended, but often it's a result of them not knowing what either the full capabilities are or not knowing what the full limitations are, and then kind of navigating within those guidelines of how to make those proper decisions. And so we focused very, very heavily on ensuring that in this command school, the terminology would be consistent. They would understand how various tools and equipment would work, what were the pros and cons, when's the best time to use these things, when's the worst time to use these things. Very, very important to understand how case law impacts this, right? There's, the old saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, where people mean well and they made decisions, but not really understanding kind of what are some of the legal limitations on this. And we felt that by sharing that and providing a solid foundation with that information and that knowledge would lead to better decision makers, but particularly in a time compressed critical incident type of environment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know my next question's about the operators. What are their issues? What are they talking about as far as challenges? I think it fits into that command element where I could think of a couple off the top of my head. I won't name them, but you have a large contingent of field units there. You have special units there, but then you have a leader who may not be as well trained or at decision making. They're conflicted with that whole de-escalation agenda that sometimes is counter to what is needed at the time. And so in my role, I've always deferred to the experienced tactical operators. I can think of a lieutenant in particular, Lieutenant Marv, he's listening, would come up to me and say, "Hey, Cap or Commander, I don't know that this is the best idea. How about if we try it like this?" And so I think it's important for especially as things develop in the field, that we listen to the experienced operators and at least consider it. What are you hearing from the operators? What are their challenges today?
Well, I think what you touched on is true and it's important. And, this is probably a challenge that has existed, since the first officer ever walked a beat, in this disconnect sometimes between leadership and the operators, and understanding that, unfortunately, rank does not necessarily equate to competence. And, I say that, having had a full lobotomy, and so I'm probably as guilty of these sins as anybody. But it is true, there is a need to have the humility to defer to those that you have entrusted to get the specific training, to have the knowledge, to have the background, to have the information to guide you in these incidents. And so hopefully that takes place. But I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that is still certainly a challenge. Other things that we're hearing from the officers are things that you actually touched on a little bit. Our limited resources. Staffing is an issue, and having the adequate number of personnel to do some of the missions that they're being asked to do is often a struggle. And I think we're going to continue to have challenges with limited resources. They're concerned about developing legislation. We have incidents that have less than desirable outcomes take place in one part of the country. But living in the social media world that we live in now, news travels, faster than it ever has. And the impacts, the systemic impacts are far, far greater than they've ever been before. So an incident that might happen in a certain area can have dramatic effects on policing in different parts of the country, where states are quick to pass legislation limiting the utilization of specialty impact munitions in crowd control scenarios, or the use of chemical agents, or the list goes on and on. And while I understand the emotion in why this takes place, it's very, very short-sighted. And so you have legislators passing laws where you can't use specialty impact munitions in a civil unrest. And yet when you sit down with them and explain, you understand that you're taking away tools that allow us to stay 300, 400 feet away from people and minimize the potential for injury or violence between protesters and law enforcement. But now the only thing that's left is a 39-inch hickory wood riot baton. You've actually increased the danger to everybody involved, depending on obviously a variety of circumstances. And so again, while I think some believe that they're well-intended, that the actual practical consequences of those decisions are not favorable. They're actually harmful. And so I think a lot of our operators, they recognize that they understand the emotion that's involved in these things, but they're struggling with, they are the ones that bear the brunt of the outcome of some of this legislation. So I think, things like that, the legal questions surrounding qualified immunity and how that's impacting them, we're hearing things along those lines.
Yeah, and I 100% agree with you in the use of force issues, especially chemical agents at out of control, crowd control situations, riots. Sometimes they're described by the media as mostly peaceful, and so they exclude the cars turned over, cars on fire, windows smashed, vandalism and theft. And we've seen some really out of control the vehicle sideshows, 100 viewers, 4 or 5 cars, people hit, run over, vandalism, damaged property. So when we reduce the force options in San Francisco, we've never had the ability to have tasers with the police department. The sheriff, BART, other agencies surrounding do, but we've never had the ability to carry a taser. As those force options are reduced, just like you said, all that's left is the baton, fist, or a firearm. So
Right.
The legislation, do you have a foot in the door to Congress to say, hey, can I appear as an advisor on this clearly not so well defined piece of legislation that you're looking to push forward anytime you reduce those force options?
We do. So we don't lobby. We're not in the field of lobby. We're prohibited from that really as a nonprofit, which I'm perfectly comfortable with. But what we do offer is ourselves as a resource. So we are very frequently speaking with congressional staffers, congressmen and women, senators, and sharing information with them about various legislation and the impacts of that, what we believe, and then just very objectively try and state, here are the likely outcomes of this. I mean, if you take this away, this is what's left, and this is how that tool is then applied, and these are the outcomes. So we are doing what we can to educate, to really try and be objective and factual in our information sharing, to provide some rational input in what are frequently emotional decision-making processes. And that's, as we well know, even just professionally, when we begin to become emotional in a call for service, in an encounter, and we lose our rational, objective perspective, that's when we tend to get in trouble. And that's when we tend to not make necessarily the best decisions. And so that's what we're really kind of advocating for is let's slow this down and let's really think. We all want the same thing. Mm-hmm. We all want encounters between law enforcement and the people that they serve and protect are successful, that they're positive encounters. But as I frequently remind folks, particularly in the media, law enforcement can be 100% correct and professional in everything we do, and yet we never control more than 50% of the equation. Mm-hmm. The other half does. And the decisions that they make and the behavior that they engage in and the actions that they take impact what we do. And so it cannot be an equation where there's only 100% accountability assigned to law enforcement alone, and then expect a change or an improvement in these challenging encounters. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah. And it actually, goes back to what we were just talking about as far as thinning personnel and lessening of the resources. 50%, I agree. When they talk about de-escalation and you pull up and there's a guy running around naked with a machete, we've only got control of that 50% ourselves, and the onus is on the individual. And the expectations, I think, are sometimes unreal. They're not realistic on what an officer can or should be able to do in those situations. In my opinion, de-escalation options are very limited.
Well, yeah. And, again, given the specific environment of the example that you're sharing, the officer has multiple considerations, their personal safety, but the safety of others. And then whether people, particularly the skeptics, want to acknowledge this or not, the officers or deputies, actually do consider the welfare of the suspect or the subject, however you want to classify them. I mean, we're also doing what we can to control the situation, but we have priorities. We have these safety priorities. So the safety priorities for us will always be the innocent bystander, the innocent citizens are first and foremost. Secondly, will be our safety. And then lastly, will be the safety of the suspect. But the reason that they're last is because they have the greatest control over everybody's safety, meaning all they have to do is be lawful and compliant, and no one's going to be hurt. And so when you think about how dynamic that environment is, as brutal as this might sound, a form of de-escalation may in fact be the use of deadly force. If the person is in proximity to, a lady and her small child and is beginning to swing the machete, to de-escalate that, to stop that, might necessitate deadly force.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, if they're out in an open parking lot and there's nobody within 300 yards of them, and you have a nice proper containment set up, everybody's able to stay away from the individual, and you just allow this person to sort of run out of gas, so to speak, over a period of time, that's great de-escalation.
Mm-hmm.
But they're very, very different. And once again, there are other factors, there are other influencers in that whole environment that we do not control. As much as we would love to, it is beyond our control. We can control our actions, we can control our decision making, but that's really it.
Right. Yeah, a couple other factors regarding equipment, the claims of the militarization of law enforcement in general and tactical teams specifically. Have the restrictions of the 1033 government program to take military resources that they're offering, has that caused any issues? I think 2 presidents back, they ordered more restrictions and guidelines before any law enforcement agency can access the 1033 equipment.
Yeah, so that's been, a roller coaster. It's had its ups and downs, and has been somewhat repetitive in nature. But you are correct. A little while ago, there was a move originally to entirely restrict a lot of equipment on the 1033, the military surplus program, from law enforcement, just a flat out prohibition. Ourselves and some others were able to work a lot with Congress and get them to see that that type of knee-jerk reaction was in fact going to be more harmful than helpful in the long run. But what was I think a well thought out compromise was to have training requirements. Before you could procure a certain period, a type of equipment, you need to ensure that you had training in place and that people fully understood and appreciated how certain pieces of equipment were going to be utilized and under what circumstances and things like that. Mm-hmm. Then, some of those eased a little bit, and then they came back with a little bit more of a bite and a little bit greater restriction. And so it's an ongoing process of trying to keep people informed. And again, as I said, just kind of educate them on what are some of the potential unintended consequences of certain restrictions or things of that nature. But one of the things that surprises me is when I'm, dealing with people in the Beltway, is I think they forget, or maybe they didn't know, but 80% of law enforcement agencies in the United States have fewer than 50 sworn personnel. 49% have fewer than 10 sworn personnel. And so, the agencies that often need access to 1033 surplus equipment are not your large metropolitan, police departments or your large sheriff's departments, sheriff's offices in the United States, but they're these smaller agencies that are engaged in multi-jurisdictional, regional cooperation because they don't have it otherwise. And to get it, it's going to take a long period of time for an agency to drive it up or bring it to them or ship it to them or things like that. So there are impacts as a result of that, but it's just an ongoing effort of trying to keep people informed about how these can actually benefit the constituencies, not harm them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we've seen some of the criticism of not going into a building after a mass shooting or going to school or wherever. And I'm sure you could think of the top 6 events that come to my mind where cops were criticized for their reaction when we had a really great program here out of our Northern California UASI, the Urban Area Security Initiative. It was called Urban Shield, and 36 or 37 SWAT teams from around the world. We had teams from Saudi Arabia, Israel, the FBI, and every state just about sent a team. And it was a 36-hour round robin. Everybody got an hour to have a scenario presented, and then they responded how they would with simulations in an environment where raiders categorized their response, timed them, and it was an awesome display. I got to be a part of it 4 or 5 times in my time with SFPD, but that was halted again because of an idealistic view that we shouldn't be training like this. But you can't have it both ways. The training is essential, especially in these sort of unusual circumstances where you talked about a backdrop where you have a wide open parking lot, a clear positioning of officers ratio to suspect, no bystanders, ideal situation. When does that ever happen? Instead, we're talking about a crowded bus or a rail or a shopping mall or a school where things are cloudy and not so clear. Are we ever going to see training like Urban Shield given back, or has that ship sailed?
That's a great question. And I'm very familiar with, Urban Shield. I was also an active participant in that for several years. And arguably, it was one of the, if not the premier tactical training event in the country. It served as a model for helping not only individual agencies recognize what their real capabilities and limitations were, but I think it also goes back to what we were speaking about earlier, was very, very demonstrative of the benefits of interagency cooperations and knowing how you could help one another, particularly in large scale events. And so to your point, when you look at some of the largest incidents that have garnered national attention, that have required multi-agency cooperation response, it hasn't been what we would have hoped for, all of which could and should be alleviated by programs such as Urban Shield. And when you think about the real reason behind Urban Shield being sort of shut down is tragic. I mean, I wish we lived in utopia as well. I think everybody does, but we don't. And I think we're seeing some, again, well-intended ideas play out with less than desirable outcomes through increase in crime, increase in violent crime, recidivism in crime, and things like that, where some of these ideas just haven't played out as well.
Yeah,
there's evil in our world, and we have to acknowledge that. And if you want peacekeepers to be able to effectively deal with it, they have to be well trained, well equipped, and supported in those efforts.
Yeah, well, that said, I'd like to investigate a little bit more about strategies and any introduction of AI or virtual reality in training. But first, I'd like to take a moment and thank our sponsor. Endorsed by law enforcement agencies from LA to New York, Let's Respond helps bring enhanced awareness and safer resolutions in response to hostage crisis situations. With Let's Respond, you'll instantly save costs and improve time to response and resolution without ever needing to deal with the hassle of setting up a throw phone. Explore the benefits firsthand by visiting letscorp.com/respond. That's letscorp.com/respond. And we're back, and I'm speaking with Thor Eells, Executive Director of the National Tactical Officers Association. And we've seen some disastrous results involving arrest and search warrant service. Are we following the matrix in intelligence gathering? How can we improve? I'm thinking about some old scenarios as well as some that have unfolded in the last couple of years. Again, I won't point out specifics, except to say in one of the large events where part of the intelligence gathering was tracking an individual through town, seeing him go out shop, go for a jog and things like that. And of course, I'm doing the Monday morning quarterbacking where I could say, well, why didn't we pick him off then and then go into the house and do the search warrant, look for the guns and explosives and all that later? Instead, it was a standoff that I'm sure anybody can recall the disaster that happened afterwards. Are we employing the matrix, and what do we need to do to improve, and avoid going into the wrong house or being remiss in knowing that others were living there, baby in the house, pit bull in the house, grandma in the house, those kinds of things?
Yeah, that's it's a great question, and it's certainly one of the questions we keep asking ourselves, and I think sometimes kicking ourselves in thinking that we've done a very good job of providing training on risk mitigation, and then we see an incident like this, and it reminds us, well, maybe we haven't been as successful as we thought we were, and we need to double down on our efforts. I think as a whole, we have gotten better on a national level. And certainly there are regions that have done better than others. And then there are others that are very resistant, is maybe a little bit too strong a word, but they're a little bit more skeptical of buying in on some of the things that we're advocating more today because of lessons learned. Risk mitigation is the key to this, and how you go about engaging in a process of risk mitigation is directly related to the likely outcome. Not guaranteed outcome, but likely outcome. And those classes that we're offering and the training that we've been offering on risk mitigation have become more and more popular. The processes I think that we're teaching now to engage in a full, front to back, top to bottom analysis of the mission that you've been handed, and how do you go about that? What are all of the options available to you? And then as you evaluate each of those options, engage in a risk mitigation of each of those to, in the end, the cream that should rise to the top is the one that is least risky to all involved. It doesn't mean there's no risk, because we will never eliminate risk from our profession. We all know that.
Yeah,
but what
sure.
have we done to, again, getting back to what I'd mentioned earlier, the things that we can control with regard to safety? How do we maximize the safety, mitigate the risk, and then that becomes our plan that we're going to go forward with? It's getting better, but there are still incidents that we see where you were talking about uninvolved people inside, baby inside, things like that. What we know is that anytime we're entering into the bad guy's structure, so to speak, of any sort, whether it's a mobile home, an apartment, a hotel room, or a mansion, it's an away game. And there are always going to be potential unknowns and risk factors in there. And so how do we go about planning, as you said, to control the factors that we can control and avoid being in places we would prefer not to be?
Mhm.
But it's a process. It requires awareness. It requires humility, where we're acknowledging that, you know what, maybe the way we've been doing this isn't the best and we should change our ways. It requires good leadership. And unfortunately, I hate to say this, but, in several of these really high profile incidents, you have heads of agencies publicly stating, well, I didn't know they were doing this. Well, I didn't know that this was how they did these things. And, to me, the next proper response to that is, well, maybe you're the wrong person to be, leading that agency. If you don't know, why don't you know? And maybe you should be asking these questions. Gordon Graham is famous for some of his statements, if it's predictable, it's preventable. Well, there's a reason you have tactical teams. So that these are critical incidents. Maybe you should ask and educate yourself ahead of time. How do we go about this? What is our process? But leadership plays a big part in helping guide teams. And it's the leadership you were talking about, where, yes, you're the leader, you're the captain, you're the commander, but you have the intelligence coupled with the humility to take the input and then provide direction. I think in incidents where there have been poor outcomes, we find that component is often non-existent.
Yeah, and we talked earlier about leadership on scene and taking the advice of experienced people. I mean, ICS gives us that option to say, doesn't matter what rank you are, the best trained person in ICS and incident command should be the incident commander at that point. So if you've got a chief with limited experience and you're a sergeant or lieutenant who's gone through all the FEMA classes, all the post classes in incident command and tactical response, it would be remiss not to have at least that person as given the most advice to the incident command, if not being the incident commander themselves.
Yeah, I think we have to recognize that we want to use the best skill sets that we have available there.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, command and control is important. I get that. But again, these are conversations that should be had prior to a critical incident, not in the midst of a critical incident, where we do identify our subject matter experts. I mean, who are people that have the best combination of training, education, experience to be making command decisions in critical incidents. That's when you tend to see more regularly good outcomes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I want to wrap up, but I'd be remiss in not asking about technology. I mean, we've seen some really great emerging technology. Our bomb robots are better. Throw phones and devices are much better. Drones are now really capable of breaking a window and going inside and talking to a barricaded subject. What have you seen as far as the advancements of technology, and how are they helping in tactical situations?
Yeah, I mean, you summed it up very, very well. There's no question that the improvement in technology, as things have gotten smaller, more durable, more affordable, has had a huge impact on tactics. I mean, it's almost, routine now that you have some sort of robotic UAV, bomb robot, or different tactical robots specifically designed for the tactical environment to be inserted to, gain intelligence, to improve situational awareness, to establish communication, all of these things which prevent the need for officers having to make entry, to be in those places that we talked about not wanting to be. In which I think has been directly attributable to saving lives, both for officers and suspects, because It has alleviated the need for any kind of face-to-face or personal contact. I think we're going to see more and more improvements in implementation and utilization of that. I know my own team years ago, we actually had tech specialists assigned to the team that knew how to handle and work this type of equipment. I'm hearing more and more teams that are actually assigning drone operators to the team and people that have those skill sets to improve the utilization of those in various scenarios. So I think it's very important for us to be aware and to be paying attention to the improvements in the technology. They are becoming more affordable. They're have multiple uses. So it doesn't need to be just for the SWAT team. I mean, you can use drones to find missing persons, to photograph crime scenes. I mean, there are, a multitude of uses that the listeners are certainly available to, but I could not more strongly advocate or endorse technology. I mean, AI and virtual reality in training, it's something that we are working with a company, and we're very, very close to being able to put out, where we'll be able to replicate or create just about any kind of scenario imaginable in a headset and stop people at critical points to just ask them about their decision making. Why are you doing what you're doing when you're doing it? Because that's the key to everything we do, is being able to answer those three questions: why I'm doing what I'm doing, when I'm doing it. And if you can be very thoughtful and deliberate in your decision making that way, you have much, much more positive outcomes. But we'll be able to capture that. We'll be able to replay. We'll be able to show them what they were doing and why it might not have been the best decision, why we suggested this versus that. We can save it for their training files. We can have you as the commander sitting at your desk. You can be watching the training yourself just to see what the people are doing that day. So I think we're going to see tremendous leaps in our training capabilities through the improvement of virtual reality, artificial intelligence. All of that is going to have an exponential impact on our training and our performances.
Yeah, I recently talked with an executive from HTC. I've talked to Rick Smith at Axon about the virtual reality as an augment to training, where you can get more repetitions in, you can have fewer instructors to students, and the capabilities and the results have been amazing. HTC, Dan, oh gosh, I'm blanking on his last name, but he talked about the German army using virtual reality headsets in their training, almost as you would see 5 or 6 players in a video game, all sitting in remote locations in a stack, in a formation, going into a building that they're going to assault. And they talk about the retention rates, 80 to 95% retention in training, and favorable recall by the students afterwards. Hope to see more of that.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, I think we would be foolish to not pay attention to the benefits and the improvement in, as you mentioned, just the quality, the caliber of the training, the realism, the recall, all of that. The Air Force has started to use VR in their undergraduate pilot training, UPT, and has found that that's significantly shortened the pipeline and improved the performance. So there are a lot of benefits from this, and we have to stay abreast of this, because this is also a very rapidly developing environment as well, but with a lot of really pretty high speed outcomes there.
Yeah, for sure. Well, NTOA hosts several conferences and training events. What's coming up that you can share with our listeners?
Yeah, so we have our National Law Enforcement Operations Conference scheduled this year in September, run from September 8th through the 13th, which will be in Kansas City, Missouri. And then later in the year, in Phoenix, Arizona, we'll have our National Crisis Negotiations Conference, October 27th through the 31st, both of which have just continued to grow and grow every year. We do have a lot of emphasis now on not just tactical, which obviously is our backbone, so to speak, but over the last 5-10 years, we've really tried to grow our training to meet the first responders, the patrol officer, the patrol deputies, those that are first on scene to all these critical incidents that are developing and providing them with better training. We're still heavily involved in our tactical EMS, with rescue task force training, CNT. We're having a competition this year. We're going to have a national competition amongst teams that want to sign up and compete in a scenario to provide that as a unique way of helping provide training and suggestions for means of improving. But those would be our two biggest events in the near future.
Right. That's great. Well, hey, I appreciate your time, your expertise, your really thoughtful responses to these questions. And I hope you have a great conference. Love to have you back in the future and talk about what's going on in the tactical world, and especially in the advancement of AI and technology to keep our guys safe, our men and women in tactical operations safe. Thor Eells, Executive Director of the National Tactical Officers Association. Really appreciate your time. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me. Take care.
All right. Hey, to our listeners, drop me a line and let me know what you thought about today's show. We will provide some links below to the National Tactical Officers Association, some of their upcoming events. And if you're a tactical operator and you're not a member, take a look at how you can sign up and talk with Thor Eells and tell him that you saw him on the podcast or the YouTube. All right, drop us a line at policingmatters@policeone.com. policingmatters@policeone.com. Appreciate you checking in on us. Stay safe and hope to talk to you again real soon.